Hello and welcome to the Slow Ready Podcast, a casual drive into the music and culture of Goose. I'm Mike,
And I'm Alex.
and we are here today to do an in-depth breakdown of Moon Cabin, the debut album from Goose, and then get into a discussion about the live versions of these songs. As always, we have a ton of future episode topics and content planned for you all, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow our socials at Slow Ready Pod on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Our socials are the best way to keep up with all of our new episode releases and content we share between episodes. But first things first, we'd like to get into the news and notes from this week. So, among some of the chief notes from this week, big deal in the Goose community is that Goose is going to be putting on benefit concerts. They're going to be doing a show in Winston-Salem as well in Alabama. On a personal note for me, I call North Carolina home. So this is one of those moments where I'm very proud to be a Goose fan, very happy that they're taking this on themselves to give back to the community because we definitely need it. There are basically no roads in Western North Carolina if you don't know how bad it is. And fortunately for us, the pod's also going to be involved with a pre-show event before the show in Winston-Salem. So Alex, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about what they can expect from that?
Yeah, we'll be at the show, both of us, handing out stickers and saying hi to fans. Whoever wants to come out and say hi, we'd love to, say hello, grab a beer together. But there's a great event happening before the show, hosted by Drifter Merch, called Seekers on the Ridge at the Fiddlin' Fish Brewing Company, and we'll be there with a little table and stickers to hand out and sign-up sheets if anyone wants to be on our email list and get information about our socials and all that. But we'd love to grab a beer together, say hi, and chat with some of you guys.
Yeah, definitely. Super excited to be involved with this great event and definitely looking forward to meeting more people in the community. So, should be a lot of fun. Definitely hope you come by and say hello. We'd love to see you and meet you and hang out a little bit. And another big news is that Goose's recent charity show at the El Troubadour in LA, Peter has let everyone know that the soundboards are in process. So I know there was a little bit of doubt out there as to are there going to be soundboards? Is there any going to be official content released from these shows? Didn't know because it was so, private, unique, and spur of the moment seemingly. But I'm sure everyone's very excited that those soundboards are in the work because, we all live and die by those soundboards. So very exciting news there.
Yeah, and that news came via Peter's personal Twitter. So hopefully we'll see those soon. At the time of recording, they're still not up, but fingers crossed. Would love to be able to listen.
Yep, hoping any day now. And then, of course, Viva El Gonzo is officially on sale. So hoping for anyone that was planning on going, definitely hope that you lock down your tickets, your plans, your travel arrangements. It looks to be an absolutely outstanding event. Unfortunately, I don't think either one of us will be in attendance, which sucks. But for everyone that's going, hope you have an amazing time. I can't imagine that you won't.
Just a tough weekend for both of us, unfortunately, but we will have plenty of podcast content coming up on the festival and after the festival, recapping it.
Yep, and definitely cheering everyone on that's down there, even though we can't be there. And finally, we actually have a little cool giveaway coming up here that I thought you might want to tell everyone about as well, Alex.
Yeah, for the upcoming show in Winston-Salem, the charity show, we have 2 tickets we're going to be giving away in the 100 level. And we're really excited to have that announced on Instagram by the time you're listening to this. But if you share with a friend and tag a friend on any of our socials, we'll put you in for a chance to win these 2 tickets for the show. And really hope to meet you guys, whoever's interested in entering, and hand the tickets off personally.
Yeah, thrilled to be able to do that. Can't imagine that it's going to be anything less than a blast. So, yeah, definitely stay tuned for that. Without further ado, let's move into our main topic, which is talking about Moon Cabin, the very first album from our favorite band, Goose. So we did touch on some of the history and the circumstances surrounding this time period of the band in our Goose history episode in episode 2. If you haven't heard it, go ahead and check that out. Lots of good information in there. Just some fine notes about it. The band doesn't really typically consider it a studio album. A lot of the songs were written very early on at Rick's mom's house when he was still living at home before he went to college. She actually gave him feedback on some of the songs like Lead the Way and whatnot. And also there were 2 band members involved, Chris Enright and Peter Castaldi, that haven't been involved with Goose since that time, but obviously have a lot of big contributions to the overall feel and sound of the album. Do you have any thoughts on this as just an overall picture, first time effort, Alex? Just the album as a whole?
Yeah, it's a little murky in the sense that you mentioned that some people consider it a studio album, some don't. You'll see interviews or quotes that'll mention Shenanigans Nightclub as the first album of the band, and so it's just a little murky there, but it's definitely a studio effort in my opinion, and they spent 12 days in a cabin in New Hampshire recording this thing, so it is truly a studio effort when you think about it from the band's perspective. Really awesome stuff, seeing how these songs evolved from the live setting that you might see a clip or two of from 2014 or something, but into these really great indie tracks that feature a little bit of what the jam band side of this band does, but otherwise it's mostly just a great indie effort.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that assessment. It definitely has a strong indie feel from the very first track all the way to the end. However, I think that Goose does a good job here of kind of threading the needle, so to speak, and giving you the best of both worlds, in that they do still include some improv or breakdowns in the songs, a lot of them, anyways, but they don't stretch it on ad infinitum. That it's, it's appropriately used, but it does give you a little bit of a taste that they are indeed a jam band with some of the improv and free flowing movements within the songs, but it's all tempered and not overdone or trying to replicate exactly what they do in a live setting. So I definitely feel like it gives you kind of the best of both worlds when it comes to Goose. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and get into a breakdown on the first track here, which happens to be Turn Clouds? Do you have any thoughts on that one, Alex, as an opener?
Ooh, I have lots of thoughts on all the songs if we're being honest here. But this song is a really interesting way to introduce someone to Goose if they decide to check him out and the first thing they throw on is a studio album. You start immediately with like this quote that I always have ringing in my head. I believe Sting said it on some interview and he was like, if a song hasn't piqued my interest within the first four measures or something like that, it's not worth listening to. And this song, sure enough, piques my interest immediately when you're listening to the studio cut. It's got this almost old school retro radio, Billie Holiday kind of vibe on Rick's voice. And then it hits you right in the face immediately how forward the keys are by Chris Enright on this album. And it's really a theme that continues through the album, surprisingly enough, with Rick being front and center normally at a show. This is like a very keys forward album, and Chris can play, dude. We love Peter, but I just want to give Chris all the love on this track. It's really interesting also listening to the vocal effects that were chosen by Rick on this track. It's got more of like a chorusy feel, like when I think of guitar effects on his vocals than we are used to getting at a show, where he leans much more into his natural tone, I feel like now. But it's really cool how they decided to place this as the theme up front and center for the album. It's really showing the deep lyrics that Rick can write on these songs, not slapping you in the face with the themes, but if you dive into the lyrics, you're like, wow, this kid has been through a lot already in his life. And again, surprising that there's really just a short guitar solo on this thing, not really featuring what Rick does best in a lot of people's opinions here. So, what do you think? I don't want to get into too many thoughts without having a little back and forth, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely say this about this song, but probably all the tracks on the album. It's going to, by its very nature, be a little bit more restrained than what they do. They're an absolute firecracker live. We've gone over that, ad nauseum. But I think there is something to be said. Rick's been quoted numerous times in that he looks at the making of an album as a little bit of a different goal or end game than what they do on a stage every night. So with that in mind, you can definitely tell that their goals are a little bit different here as far as delivering the songs to us. And it definitely shows, but I don't think it's necessarily in a bad way. They still capture most of the energy of Turn Clouds. I do agree that it is a great track to introduce to someone, that's new to Goose. We talked about that a little bit in episode 1. And, I talked about this in that episode as well, but I think one of the more magical moments in Goose's catalog is, every single time Rick says, look around this city when they're in that breakdown and you've got the heavy organ behind it, it gives me chills every time. And this is one of the songs on the album that I think that while it is different than what they do in a live setting, I do think that it probably one of the better examples of doing justice to what this song sounds like live, because I still feel like those two different breakdowns with the look around this city that happens twice in the song, they both give me goosebumps every time. So I think this is a really great example of capturing the spirit of Goose here, and it's the first track on the album, so that's awesome.
No, totally. I actually will push back on that a little bit where I think this song of all the songs on the album, probably holds the closest true to what you'd expect to hear live, maybe along with the Lead the Way or something that we'll hear later on the album. But it's really just the vocal effects that Rick uses and the guitar just being a little less forward than you see in the live setting. But otherwise, like, they really stick to this format. And this is not a song that gets jammed out a lot, but we'll get into that more later. But just fantastic stuff. I really love the bold choice to pick a song like this versus a bigger song like Arcadia or something that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, definitely. And then moving into song 2, I mean, I can't imagine more of like a dramatic contrast between song 1 and song 2. I mean, the vibes completely flip here when you go into the Mist, which I'd love to hear how you think about this as far as the second track on this album, Alex.
I really enjoyed listening to Into the Mist, actually. We had listened to Moon Cabin getting ready for the podcast, but we've been so deep in the live setting and recapping shows lately that it was really nice to listen back to this Into the Mist and hear how it's a completely different track than what you'd expect to hear when you throw on an Into the Mist on Nugs or something. It's got almost like a stripped down feel to the instrumental intro, and you get this kind of innocent sounding palm muted guitar riff that comes in with the really beautiful keys by Enright again. And Ben is really being patient, building the song slowly. He's doing some like rim clicks and subtle hi hat work. And then it's the first dive we really get. It slaps you in the face with Rick using auto tune on his voice, adding a really like sweeping, mystical feel to the song. My only note really when I was listening to this was like, this rocks, but I really wish Trevor was turned up a bit because he's really doing some terrific stuff in the background there. And we're a Trevor podcast here. Anytime he's turned up and cranked up and up front and center, we love it. So that's always going to be in the notes. But he's doing some really great subtle funk stuff in the background here, throwing it in along with holding the pocket. And the song is just really a nice slow crescendo all the way up through the guitar solo at the end by Rick. And man, does that PRS that Rick used to play sound good. Sometimes I really miss that tone. And you hit a peak in that solo, and then we start bringing it down to get into that final chorus. And it just is a beautiful ride, even though it's a short one compared to what we get live. It's really, really well done, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Into the Mist is definitely still amazing. I do feel like I was kind of had a harsh reminder because it had been a while since I'd listened to the studio version of this, but it is, in my opinion, the most different from live to studio. It is so much more clean and subdued on this version compared to what you have in the live setting. But I also feel like even just the chorus, the feel here is more, I'd say it's like a perfect example of the indie groove label that they sometimes go under because the chorus is so much more, in my opinion, dancey on the album. It's got, I don't know, it could just be like the simple like disco beats that Ben used to favor, but it just in the live setting, I feel like it spreads its wings a lot more and becomes more of like a transformative experience. Whereas on the album, it just doesn't have as much juice as Into the Mist has typically. Now, I think it's still a great song. It sounds so original. The chord progressions, the piano arrangements, it's all fantastic. I just find myself after listening to so many Into the Mist live, wishing that it could breathe a bit more than it gets the chance to on the studio version.
Yeah, for sure. I don't really listen to it and think of wanting to see a version like this in a live setting with Goose, like the full band. But when I listened to it, my thought was like, man, Arabelo could take some notes from this version. They've struggled to play Into the Mist in the past. Not struggled, but it's not a song they pick very often because it doesn't have that energy. But you could take some notes from this studio cut and maybe apply that to that more stripped down setting. And I think it would be terrific. But now we start getting into the biggest song in Goose's history, Arcadia. Still their most popular song on all the streaming services and everything. So let's hear what you think about Arcadia, Mike.
Yeah, so with Arcadia, definitely interesting that you pointed out in Turn Clouds, it kind of had that like old-timey classic oldies feel. It sounds almost like a distorted gramophone vocal effect. Arcadia also has a different type of vocal effect in the intro, and it's interesting. It's different than what he used on Turn Clouds, but it is interesting how much Rick is using those to influence the feels of the beginning of the song. And it's so cool every time that Arcadia cuts into the clean section. It just sounds absolutely incredible as you're about to move into the verse. I've always thought Arcadia is fascinating because the verses have this kind of like walk down chord progression, but meanwhile Rick's vocal line goes up and down throughout that and weaves in and out, occasionally meets the chord progression as it's moving down, which is really interesting and neat, and part of the reason why Arcadia is just so damn catchy. And I think that on this one in particular for Moon Cabin, the mixing is absolutely critical. As you said, we are Trevor stands on this podcast. You can hear every lick of Trevor's lines, which are absolutely wonderful. He's definitely turned up high in the mix. The piano is very prominent as well, and you can hear it every step of the way. I just think they did a phenomenal job of mixing this. And while, you could probably say this about every live version of Goose, the live version is going to have more energy and just be more epic in scale. I feel like this still captures the poppy, catchy, soulful spirit of Arcadia kind of perfectly as far as an album version could be.
And this is where we differ a little bit. I gotta say, this was a little tough for me to listen through just because I was introduced to the band through that Peach Fest live cut of Arcadia. And while I love the live version so much, I don't think that this captures the emotion and funk and energy that you get in the live setting as great. But there's still a lot to really love and pick apart and listen to on this and really admire about how they took this on in the studio. Like you mentioned, another song where you get that really kind of heavier, almost chorus feel to Rick's vocals, which we never really get live. So it's interesting to listen back to. And it's something that's kind of cool sounding, honestly. So maybe we'll experiment with that more in the future. I don't know. But I think they absolutely nailed the transitions and the mix in those transitions. Like you said, very bass and funk forward. And it is really interesting, again, to our earlier note, very piano forward track, almost to the point where it's stealing the show. In this track, like one of those Western saloon tack piano sounds. Like you feel like you're walking in to grab a beer in some rural town in 1860, but really great. I just think that during the song, especially in the live setting, we're used to getting these little like Rick slashes in the verses and stuff like that. And there's no guitar, no little riffing going on. So it sounds a little hollow if you've been exposed to the live cut first. But I will say, once you get to the build at the end and the guitar solo, it is just epic. I mean, the tone nerds are probably going nuts when they hear this, but it's a really cool solo that almost goes into a dueling guitar kind of sound where Rick's just playing over himself, obviously, but it just absolutely crushes. And then it's over before you know it, and you're longing for more. But like you said, it does capture the Arcadia vibes in a lot of ways, but it just doesn't have the punch that I would like out of an Arcadia.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. I think, part of what may influence this part of the discussion at least a little bit is, I think Into the Mist was probably your favorite from the studio cuts. It was my least favorite. You really didn't care as much for the Arcadia album version. I kind of love it. I think a lot of what plays into this is just by its very nature. I think, Goose has just unlimited energy live. And I think that when you're listening to some of their studio cuts, the live versions you've become most attached to probably plays a role in how you evaluate the studio versions. I am very particularly attached to the sound of Into the Mist over the last year and a half or so. And so I think that when you go back and you haven't listened to Moon Cabin in a while, whatever is the one that you're most attached to the live version of, it's probably going to be the most jarring experience when you come back to the album. So I definitely think that's hanging out in the background here.
Your feelings are impacted by what you heard first a lot of the time. I really struggle with a lot of covers and things like that when other bands do them. So, I mean, it makes total sense. Like whatever you heard first, you get latched onto, and that's that. So, anyway, let's dive into Lead the Way a little bit. What do you think about this track on the studio, Mike? Pretty fun one.
Yeah, I love Lead the Way. It's got, like a blues boogie type feel to it. Like so many of their songs, it kind of crosses genres. The chorus sounds a little bit like back to music from decades ago, again, like kind of on that oldies feel, which pops up sporadically throughout this album. There are more spots than you initially realize where you're like, this is very 60s in just the feel of it or the vibe. They have a beautiful breakdown and a patient build up to this amazing bridge where the piano is literally pitch perfect. And then the harmonies come in and pull you back for one last chorus. I just think it's so awesome as well that Rick wrote this song when he was a teenager about his family dog. And I mean, you're talking about years before Moon Cabin arrives. Like, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. Like, how the hell was he such a good songwriter from so young? Lead the way. Awesome stuff.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure when we were that age, we were still learning how to wipe our asses. So, like, Lead the Way is incredible stuff. You really almost have a picture perfect copy of my notes and what you said. Great bluesy road trip, happy go lucky vibe to this, even though the lyrics are very deep and sad and heavy at times. Just the really uplifting feel to this song. That bridge hits and that ethereal space it gets into with that like organ in the background and Rick playing that really heavy reverb emotional riff is just fantastic and a beautiful space that you almost want to be in longer. Obviously in studio cuts you're not going to get that as often, but Ben has a really great feel on this song as well on the drums, and he's picking up the energy subtly before kind of exploding into this heavy toms work. You get into those emotional woes and you close out the song with really emotional chorus. So really interesting to listen back to it. I think we were talking about that before with Turn Clouds. I think this is the song where I felt like it sticks the most true to what you get in the live setting, but it's also evolved in that setting like everything else. So really terrific stuff and really enjoyed listening to this.
Yeah, as a parting note on Lead the Way, I definitely agree. I think it probably transforms the least in the live setting. So it's definitely going to feel familiar if you're coming to Moon Cabin for the first time. It's going to be pretty right in line with what you're expecting from that song. And then after Lead the Way, we move into what kind of becomes a trend on this album, but the first of three different interludes. Do you have any thoughts on interlude one?
Yeah, you mentioned it, that there's 3 different interludes on this album, and I kinda think this is really bold choice for the band to do on their first studio album where they have 3 different tracks labeled interlude, 2 different tracks labeled jive, and it's kind of the first hint of this band using these reprises and motifs that they'll bring up in different songs and creating new versions of songs and things like that. So I just think it's really bold that they decided to stick this on their first album. And that being said, this interlude one should really just be called Indian River Intro because it's really just a slow build with that iconic Indian River riff. But yeah, it's just a good way to get Indian River track to hit the ground running when you start that studio track. But it is a nice slow build into that song.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I 100% agree. Who takes these kind of chances on the first album? Rick's some kind of super mad genius. It's incredible stuff. But I guess the best way to look at it is it's kind of like a little trippy Indian River appetizer, I guess is how I would describe it. You said it pretty much perfectly. And so we won't spend too much time on that, but it moves into the song Indian River. So I know that you probably have a lot more thoughts on that one, Alex.
We dove into this one a little bit on our first episode as best new songs to listen to as a new Goose fan. If you want to introduce a friend to the band or something like that. And I just love this track. Just that white boy reggae version, as Mike put it in that episode. But it's definitely the most guitar forward track we've heard so far on the album. You get that really cool staccato riff you were getting at interlude one, just more prominent. And it creates a really interesting dynamic to the song because you're getting this reggae vibe to the song while getting this Eastern spirituality theme going on in the lyrics. And it's a really interesting tension, not in a negative way, that you're just getting in the song where you're like, oh man, this is just different emotions that you're writing depending on what part of the song you're listening to. I think it's some of the best lyrical work you'll get out of Goose in general, but on this album so far, I just once again commenting on how remarkable it is to have that much emotional development at such a young age. I mean, in my early 20s, I was a shithead. I couldn't imagine doing a track like this or even like writing a speech or a essay that had 1/10 of the depth of this song. So just terrific stuff. And this is again a Trevor forward song in parts. I love the bass solo in this thing. Finally given Trevor the major shine he deserves on this album. And it leads into that really beautiful Sanskrit passage that we get to end the song on that final bridge from the Bhagavad Gita that translates to that which pervades the entire body, know it to be indestructible. Nothing can destroy the imperishable soul. Like, what? I would never have even considered doing something like this in my 20s. So, just amazing stuff. Absolutely love this track. And I think the more you listen to it, it's one of those where you hear more and more stuff. And I really, really, really hope they bring back that bridge in the live setting because they used to do it and they don't do it so much anymore.
Yeah, I don't even know that there's that much left for me to say. You kind of covered all of it. I definitely agree with everything that you said. I definitely prefer this layout of Indian River. They also do the 80s synth heavy version, which is still great. Like, don't get me wrong, these chords, these lyrics, it's going to be a good song either way, but I do lean heavily towards this Moon Cabin style layout. Definitely, thought provoking and deeply introspective lyrics. And I think that, you pointed out the Sanskrit section. I think it's also so cool that the music also changes as the language that he's singing in changes, and it really matches from a tonal perspective what you would expect as you're moving into Sanskrit. The music kind of picks out a vibe that I think very much works with that change in language. And it's just such a damn catchy and beautiful song. So, yeah, Indian River is one of my favorites to listen to, just out and about. So, yeah, great stuff.
That tension that we talked about before in the song, it really kind of just disappears in that moment, and that's what makes it almost feel more like a bridge feel, even though you're getting some of the same rhythmic riffing on it. So very interesting stuff, which then leads into interlude 2. So do you have any thoughts on this one? It's definitely the one we've seen the most in the live setting lately, but I really like it on the studio cut.
Yeah, I do too. It's, they have all these interludes and they all, at least for me anyways, kind of work as like little jam appetizers going before they go into the next song. I will say this one probably has more potential in the live setting, which is probably why they've played it more in the live setting because it is a bit more avant-garde than the, interlude 1 or interlude 3, which we'll talk about here in a second. But it really works on the album, and again, I'm so proud of them for taking like such courageous choices on their first album when they don't really, quite know what they're doing yet. And here are all these just bold decisions that I don't think other artists would make.
Yeah, it's that indie inspiration. Like it makes me think of some of my favorite indie acts. Hearing these interludes, the vocal ooze are really beautiful. You get almost like an Imogen Heap hide and seek with that vocal effect that Rick's using, and really great unexpected transition point to get into the funky jive one. So, let's hear your thoughts on that, Mike.
Well, as I've said several times, funk is my favorite genre of music, and I started off my notes on this song as a funky beast with a bunch of exclamation points, because that's exactly what it is. The lines on the bass from Trevor propel this song forward with so much energy, and the bass lines themselves, while they're also propelling and driving the song, they're also earworms on their own. That's just how good the bass is on this track. I love the heavy organ, which features fairly prevalently through a lot of the tracks on this album. It's kind of a theme almost, but love that. Not as always as common in typical music, but they're using the hell out of it on this album, and it works in every spot that they do. And I love the lullaby almost style breakdown that they have before coming back on full attack at the end. It works so well. And again, not something that your brain would probably think of right away, but Goose is just, going for it. I love Jive One so much.
Yeah, those transitions on the keys that you brought up was one of the big notes I had bolded in my show notes where you get these almost grand piano sweeping mystical sounds. Like it made my head go immediately to Legend of Zelda Fairy Fountain Fives, which again we're showing our nerd card, but just terrific. And it just smacks you in the face. It's nothing like the rest of the song sounds. Just transitioning into these different funk portions, and I really don't know what else they could have named this song because Jive is just the perfect name, even though it's got, again, a little bit of tension to it where you've got these heavy pent up feelings that you feel like Rick's getting off his chest about letting go of day to day weight and living in the moment. And it's just a lovely sentiment. And the funk portion and the vibe of the song really fits with the ending of the song, but at the beginning when you're feeling that weight from the lyrics, it's almost like again an interesting dynamic to the song. So once again, very Trevor and Rick Ford, and Ben is doing some absolutely terrific stuff, kind of doing what he does best, doing his hi-hat and snare work and highlighting different portions of the riff via his syncopation and accent work. So just you can really sense the tight connection these guys had early on in the band, and it just really shines in this recording. So terrific stuff. I think the jives themselves are kind of the crown jewels of this album when you think about full band work on this.
Yeah, that's definitely a great point to make. They're very cohesive as far as like everyone's kind of moving and pulling the same way, which is what you love to see. And then going from Jive 1, we move into Rosewood Heart, which I know is very high up on the list of favorite songs for both of us here on the podcast. So why don't you give me some of your opening thoughts on Rosewood Heart?
Rosewood Heart just melts my heart every time, man. Just it's so good. And this studio cut's no exception. It's very, very interesting listening to this because so much of the live version of this song holds true to this, but they've also evolved it so much. And I think it's the best balance that we get on this album in that regard. Trevor and Ben are just early MVPs on this song. Beautiful keys work going on as well by Enright again. And the guitar work on this just sprinkled in with nice textures that lead into a great rhythm and vocal driven song is just terrific stuff. So I really can't say much more other than this is just like a melts into your chair or couch or car seat wherever you are listening to this, that it's just an emotional ride and something that I have a hard time even breaking down sometimes because you get so emotional listening to this song.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosewood is one of those songs where, my favorite Goose song probably changes by the day, but I would probably guess that it's up there, top 3 as far as most days that I would ask someone ask me, I'm going to say that's my favorite song. I think that it's one of the most unique songs that I've ever heard by any artist, not just Goose. I feel like every time I hear Rosewood, whether it's studio or any of the, various live versions, it definitely more than most songs that I've experienced in my life transports me to another place. I feel like the verses especially sound close to like nothing I've ever heard. And with the piano in the background in those verses, it's just absolutely magical. And I learned something that was, this is a little bit nerdy, so I won't belabor this point, but I did find it interesting. This song's written in A minor, which the 4 chord in A minor would be D flat, but they use a D major chord in the verses, which minor keys typically have a little bit more of a negative or introspective or deeper or heavier feel. And that major D chord really gives you a positive lift. So it's still serious, but it's a little bit brighter in feel. And I think it's that unique combination that makes me just gush poetically about how these verses just sound like nothing I've ever heard before. It's an absolutely incredible song.
Yeah, and it takes you on a journey, like you said. It feels like it's part of that world building that we're so accustomed to now with Rick in its earliest studio setting here. So, really interesting note on the music theory behind the song a little bit there, Mike. But really, really cool stuff to kind of break that down a little bit. I'd love to get into that more on a future episode, maybe, of some of the interesting musical stuff for the nerds like us. But Rosewood Heart in both of our top fives, just terrific stuff. So, really hard to talk about it. Like I said, it's just so emotional. But that takes us into interlude 3 and then Jive 2 to close out the album. And I really want to hear your thoughts on this interlude and then Jive 2.
Yeah, I'll kind of cover both because I don't have a ton of notes on Interlude 3. At the end of the day, it's a very spacey and distorted Jive 2. So, again, little jam appetizer. Jive 2, however, really does a great job of feeling like it's related to Jive 1, yet also still being its same thing. You can kind of recognize instantly that musically they are siblings almost, or in the same family in some way at least. There's a little bit more push and pull between the verses and the breakdowns in Jive 2 as in contrasted with Jive 1. Love Trevor's work on this. We're going to get tired of saying that, but Trevor is featured prominently on this one as well, and he sounds incredible, also driving the tune forward. And I love the feeling like you're kind of spinning out of control when you're exiting the song. It's a little bit hard to explain, but it almost feels like you're spiraling towards the outro or end of the song. It's a really wild feeling and it's very trippy, but it's very awesome.
So awesome. And I think this is the longest song on the album for good reason. It just continues to solidify itself as the best Jive for me the more I listen to it. And it has the most soul feel on the entire album, in my opinion, this song in particular. You get Rick's vocal delivery is very soul inspired, in my opinion. And these like great little organ shots you're getting from Enright also kind of give me like that going to church vibe. And just that little subtle hint really does a lot for this song. I think there was a wise man that once said, just a little bit goes a long way. Oh, wait, that's this song. And it's really fun to reflect back on this and see how they were experimenting with sound and a bold choice to close an album here to kind of do a reprise of Jive 1 in a slower, more slow build format like this. It kind of is a preview into the live setting that you might jump to after listening to this studio cut where you're getting these cool pivots in sound via their solos, getting this 70s and 80s vibe, and you close out the song with a signature explosive peak. And like I said, immediately after listening to this, I was like, Jive 2 is the best. I'm going to go listen to every live cut I possibly can of this. So it did its job. Just terrific. And I think a great way to close the album, even if it's untraditional compared to some other acts you might listen to.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I live for those little take me to church pops from the organ. That's definitely like what makes Turn Cloud so great in my mind. So, yeah, totally agree with you. Amazing way to close it. And I love ending on that dizzying, spinning outro. So that's kind of our thoughts on Moon Cabin, and we thought what might be fun to do now, having talked about the album itself, is to go into some of our favorite versions of the live songs and how they maybe change a little bit from the album to the live setting. So, with that being said, do you want to start off with maybe we'll go over the jives first, Alex, and what your picks were there?
Yeah, sure. I think I've mentioned it before on an episode, but the thing I'm chasing most in the live setting is finally catching a jive fecta in order, jive one into jive two into jive Lee. So I thought it'd be fun to go back and listen to the first known version that we have of the jive fecta from November 13th, 2021 at the Echo in Dallas. They were clearly very excited to do this, but also in a time crunch. So it's a much shorter version of these songs than we're used to getting. But I just wanted to kind of note that it was really cool. It was the first time they played through it. You get some really fun back and forth from Rick and Peter and Jive One, almost like that nursery rhyme feeling to the song, Ring Around the Rosie vibes. And then you get into a super melodic Jive One jam, like you'd expect from Rick and Co. Nothing groundbreaking, like I said, but fun. But the transition into Jive Two, I find really fun because there's like three people in the crowd who recognize it, and one guy is very loud, just going "yeah" in the background of the venue. It just I like listening to that for some reason. It just made me very very excited for them. And you get the slow groove of Jive 2 in that transition. You get that retro synthy sound that Peter so loves, almost creating an interesting dynamic that you wouldn't expect out of this song for a minute, and then he goes right back into his clav work and great Trevor bass work as always on this. And you get kind of an emotional solo to close this thing before going into the Jive Lee, which is in hyperspeed because they were clearly on a time crunch here. Short version of Jive Lee, but it got an even bigger crowd response on this transition after the Jive 1 to Jive 2 transition. And it's just Clav City to start this thing. Peter's ripping, so funky. And then we transition into kind of this really heavy wah, heavy solo by Rick that just explodes into a great Jive Lee closing that you'd expect with Ben pushing the pace and a dance party to close out that set one at the Echo in Dallas. So really fun listen. Any notes on the jives that you wanted to highlight there, Mike, on the live setting?
Yeah, I love your pick. I mean, how can you do better than the first time it happened? I think we're both, dying to see Jivefecta if we ever get so lucky. I also picked one. I picked the Jivefecta though from the Salt Shed this fall tour. Not to say one is better or worse or anything. They're just different time periods of the band. But I feel like the Salt Shed run kind of gives you a good snapshot of where the band's at in this current time with Cotter and some of the things that they've been trying. I will say that I think that the Jives as a whole probably maybe along with them and Turn Clouds, it probably changed the least in the live setting, but the jams change a lot. And the jams for Salt Shed are a lot different in that they're a lot more extended because they weren't as on much of a time crunch. And you get a lot of cool highlights from that Salt Shed run where you're seeing, Pete's doing some of those Mario Kart runs that we've talked about at high speed and intensity. And then, you've got the very like straight from the outer reaches of outer space funk vibes that they put down in the Jive Lee. And they take each one for a little bit of a walk. So it's a lot of fun. I'm very biased towards the Salt Shed run from this year in general. Just the overall quality is outstanding. And yeah, love the Jive Fecta there.
I was so jealous of that run at the Salt Shed, and those are great versions of the jives and the jivefecta. It was a buddy of mine's first Goose show ever. He wasn't familiar with any of the catalog, and I was like cursing his name. So awesome stuff. And Cotter's brought so many cool new dynamics to the album compared to what you'd hear from what Ben has done in the past. And it's been leading to some more interesting peaks and valleys here and some more different emotion being pulled through. So great stuff. So, where do we want to go next? Let's maybe talk about Into the Mist or something like that. That has a little more variation than some of these other songs.
Yeah, I'm dying to get into the Mist live because, as I said, I felt like the studio was probably the most disappointing for me personally. But a lot of that again just has to do with what I've come to expect from Into the Mist live because it rarely misses in the live setting. And I highlighted the 11/9/21 show from the Republic in New Orleans, which on a personal note is my favorite city in the world. Really like this version. It in particular improves as much the most live. It really has an ability to become quite expansive and diverse musical destinations. I love the vibes here between Rick and Peter. They're back and forth in a very chill, blissy vibe. It's terrific energy to close. And the middle section of this jam in particular is a very unique feel that I don't even want to like necessarily try to describe it. It is blissy, but I just ask if you go back and listen to it, you'll hear what I'm talking about. It has a completely unique feel to it.
Love that. I gotta get all your picks and put them on a playlist because we didn't consult each other before the episode on this at all. So I think maybe we can put together a Nugs playlist of both of our picks for this episode and put it in the show notes. But one note that I want to say before I dive into my pick is Mike and I talked before the episode about like the Cap run this year had the best versions of some of these songs on that Moon Cabin night, and we were trying to just dive a little bit deeper back into the catalog on a lot of these. So I want to shout out that Cap version here real quick because it's the goat. But anyway, I picked up Into the Mist from October 25th, 2019 at the River Street Jazz Cafe in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And it was really fun doing the prep for this episode, diving into some older versions of these songs in the live setting. And this stood out amongst those live cuts I listened to. The band still has some of like that rawness you'd expect from an early band, and you get a really great Trevor Ford version of this song with some smaller energetic jams breaking up the choruses, and then a closing jam that kind of takes you into almost like this jazz club chill atmospheric space with Peter working some like subtle retro siren-y texture in the background, almost like what you'd expect to hear out of a retro video game or something in the back, but it works. And then Rick's just working this great slow build solo that explodes with Ben picking up the energy once again, as he does best, and just a straight shred fest. So great stuff. Can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, I actually did listen to that Into the Mist that you picked recently, and I totally agree. It was so awesome listening to Trevor on that one. He sounds absolutely all the way turned up through the roof, and the bass lines are just absolutely outstanding. And the improv went to some really interesting places. So, yeah, great pick for Into the Mist there.
Really interesting on these early cuts with that rawness. There aren't like as many of these motifs that you're accustomed to hearing in the current live setting. So it almost feels like you're listening to a completely different person soloing sometimes when Rick's doing his stuff. But anyway, let's move on to the next song.
Yeah, that's a really good call out. I totally agree with that. But yeah, let's talk about what your pick was for one of our favorites, Rosewood Heart.
Ooh. So we were lucky and had the privilege to hop on WTED recently to highlight a full show for them. And Mike shouted out one of his favorites to me as we were deciding the Ryman Auditorium show from 2023 in Nashville, Tennessee on March 31st. And we broke this down for WTED. And the more I've listened to it, the more I've grown to love the Rosewood Heart from the show that closes out set two. It starts off really as you'd expect Rosewood Heart, emotional, uplifting solo out of the main portion of the song. And it appears, if you watch the video and reading online about people who were there, it appears like Peter was having some kind of trouble with his rig during the show, during Rosewood Heart. But once he got it sorted out, he started taking this song into like a darker space. And you get these really cool descending riffs that almost sound like a trippy rated R version of Super Mario World, dropping down into the pipe and eating some trippy mushrooms. And it just evolves into this great riff that they keep repeating and Rick latches onto. But it's really one of the great examples of Peter gaining some confidence and taking a lead on some of these jams that we hadn't seen very much to this point in the band. But this version really steps out and shines compared to some of the other versions I've heard because it explores that dark space a little bit while also being uplifting and having that nice push and pull and tension that you don't always get out of Rosewood Heart.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Peter levels up and grows, probably tour to tour as much as anyone. It's absolutely incredible to see how every single time he comes back, he comes back better. I think that the Ryman run last year, pretty much all of 2023, had my brain, heart, and ears in a vice grip. Those shows are just so incredible, start to finish. They owned my life for a good majority of last year. So that Rosewood is absolutely outstanding. I went with for my pick, which some people, there's a few things that you could potentially knock here. It's a festival set. It's a featured guest is on it. So, there's some things that people may hold against me, but I don't really think that the normal rules apply to Goose. They don't really mail it in for festival sets or anything like that. And I went with the Rosewood from Borderlands featuring Dawes, who actually, funny enough, will be down in Mexico with Goose next year and is a terrific band if you haven't had the chance to listen to them. Dawes is very talented. Would definitely highly recommend checking out their stuff, especially if you like indie music. But this jam is absolutely awesome. Taylor, the guitarist from Dawes, goes back and forth with Rick. It's really, really exciting. They have two different peaks in the first Blissey part where him and Rick are kind of feeding off of each other, weaving their riffs inside and outside of each other, and kind of collectively just expanding into wild directions. And then the back half of the jam is a little bit more restrained, but they just patiently build and work their way up to something absolutely outstanding. So it really offers a lot more than you might expect from it going in, given all those things I said, festival set, feature guests. They don't really take it that way. It's just 26 minutes of awesome.
This version is so good. I've listened to this one many, many times, and it was very close to being my pick. So just want to shout out how great of a choice this is. And Goose, unlike most bands, really thrives in the festival setting, in my opinion. They don't hold back. You're not gonna get, the restrained set list you might expect from other artists. So great choice, man. And how about Arcadia? Let's dive into that a little bit. What'd you pick for Arcadia?
Yeah, I almost want to let you go first because I have a feeling that we are going to end up at the same place here because we've talked about this Arcadia before, but I went with Mission Ballroom in Denver, Colorado, which I'm going to just stop here for a second and say, is that also your pick, Alex? Because I think it might be.
Of course it is. We've geeked out about this version way too many times. There's a reason it almost won Gym of the Year in 2021, and it's kind of a travesty it didn't. So anyway, I want to hear your thoughts.
As you would expect, it's super funky. Love every single thing about Trevor's playing on this one. Really, he does a great job of. There's so many times where Trevor's driving and propelling the jam. In this one, he's driving it, but he's also wandering about and just, taking interesting chances left and right. I think that's really great. I love the heavy clav from Pete and Rick's runs at times flowing both with Pete and against Pete, contrasting, they transition into ethereal bliss section with classic piano at that point, and then Rick's just got some very intricate, dense runs leading up to an incredible peak at the end. So this jam's just got everything you could want and then some. I'll leave the rest to you.
You've nailed that. If you want to talk about my qualms with the studio cut of this song, this version has none of that. And part of me doesn't even want to dive in to this because I want people to experience it without like any thoughts in their head before going in. But if you're at this point in the podcast and you haven't heard this before, like pause, go listen to this version of Arcadia from the Mission Ballroom, November 22nd, 2021, and then come back. But like you said, the jam on this thing goes in this awesome, ethereal, blissy space that just builds in this beautiful, soaring jam. And Ben and Jeff are just playing this absolutely perfect, allowing for the beauty and the space to shine in this song that we don't always see with Ben necessarily. Was one of his biggest criticisms, but on this version, this is the exception to that. And the slow crescendo on this thing that builds into a crazy peak is just amazing. If you had kind of turned this on midway through and didn't tell someone who they were listening to and they had their eyes shut, not looking at the track name in the car or something, they might think they're listening to like Prince solo or something. It's just so emotional. And then obviously, it builds and builds into the outro you'd expect from Arcadia. Punch you in the face with energy. Awesome. You get that little high pitched note that Rick always hits, and you're like, this is amazing. Like, it's one of those weird feelings you get when Arcadia ends, that note hits, and you're like, fuck yeah, that's amazing. This is cool as hell. And you're like happy, but also like you want more of that dance party. So it's just great stuff. Love Arcadia. Nothing beats it in the live setting.
And clearly to us, that is the runaway goat Arcadia. So yeah, definitely echoing Alex. Check that one out for sure if you somehow at this point haven't heard it. And with that, why don't we move into Indian River? I would love to hear about what you chose for this because obviously there's a wide range of sounds with Indian, like we discussed. So interested to see what you went with here.
Yeah, so I actually kind of took a zag where you might zig on this, and I picked a shorter version of the song from February 15th, 2018, at the Octave in Covington, Kentucky, which, if you listen to our episode 2 about the history of Goose, you'll know why this venue was so special to Goose. And this is just about an 8-minute version of Indian River. nice and short, but it's really cool that it's one of the earliest soundboards you can get access to on Nugs and is readily available to most people. And it holds very true to that studio setting, but I just thought it was really fun to go back and listen and hear how the band's sound has evolved since then. And you can hear already how they've tried to tweak the song a little bit. You've adjusted some of the vocal flair from Rick's vocals on this. You kind of have ditched some of that to get more of Rick and Peter's natural tones and their harmonies. So just thought it was great. And fantastic Trevor bass solo on this one, leading into that Bhagavad Gita bridge, which you don't get anymore. So I just was listening to this and I was like, man, it's really cool to hear this in the live setting. I kind of want to hear this again. So anyway, nothing too crazy about it compared to the studio cut. It's just really cool to, if you listen to the studio cut and then this version back to back, it's like, oh, this has kind of changed a little bit, but it's still holding true to this format.
Yeah, I love that pick, and we kind of talked about it in Goose history. Obviously, the Octave in Kentucky was a very big venue. A lot of great things happened for the band there. So those shows are very highly re-listenable. Definitely love that Indian as well. I went with 21122 from Old Forester's Paris Town Hall, which is a mouthful, in Louisville, Kentucky. And it has the reggae layout like on Moon Cabin, which we both prefer. And it also has, if you're not familiar, they frequently with Indian River will include what they call a Delta Jam, which is a complete 180 from the song proper. It, is, I guess, up tempo, blues, funk, just kind of raging piano. It's just a completely different feel for the song. And I'm never going to get sick of hearing the Delta Jam. I want it included on all of the Indian Rivers that I listen to. But this one in particular gets extended a bit more than that section typically does. And it even goes into at the end into some more dark experimental Goose where Pete's just kind of throwing things at the wall here and seeing what sticks. And it's really fun to go on that ride with them. And yeah, just great Indian River here.
Love a reggae Indian River. We like the 80s synth version too, but it just doesn't hit the same. So, what else we got left on the album? Let's see. We got interludes. Do you have any thoughts on the interludes at all, Mike? Shout those out real quick.
I don't have anything particular that I didn't already say in the Moon Cabin section, but if you've got something, go for it, man.
No, nothing really crazy. I mean, they've been experimenting with it a little bit more this year than they have in the past. We've seen Interlude 2 pop up a few times as a really cool transition piece, maybe unexpectedly. It's almost so subtle that you might not recognize you're getting an Interlude 2 till you look at the set list after the show. But really, we only got the other interludes at the Cap run this year, and that was just to complete the Moon Cabin album. So, really, not a lot to break down there in the live setting. So, how about we turn clouds then here, Mike? What'd you pick for this one?
Yeah, so I went with July 23rd, 21 at the Pines Music Park in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I haven't seen your pick for this, but I'm just guessing, knowing the both of us, that you probably went with Julian Lage. So I tried to, intentionally venture out and grab something different here. And I definitely feel like this is worth your attention. It's, the jams kind of got that same feel. They usually run with that organ back soulful vibe that you hear from the peaks on the album. And it usually just gets blown up into a bigger deal in live setting. But this one takes it even a little bit further than I typically hear it. It's definitely a little bit longer by at least a few minutes than Turn Clouds typically is. And there's a little bit more exploration and chance taking in the jam. It's one of those songs where, for the most part, I know there are a couple exceptions out there that we all know about, but for the most part, this one probably changes the least or close to the least from the album version. So a lot of the turn clouds out there are very similar, but this one goes a little bit deeper, a little bit further, and so for that reason I picked it.
Yeah, this is a great version. I actually recently listened back to this, and Turn Clouds, like you said, doesn't necessarily venture too far from what you'd expect to get out of the song structure of it. But of course, I went with Julian Lage. You know me too well, buddy. Awesome version we got in the Salt Shed this year, and really, we already gushed about Julian Lage on our recap episode covering the Salt Shed shows a few episodes ago. And while A Western Sun was really the crown jewel of his time up on stage with the band, this is really still a great version of Turn Clouds, where Julian just really shows his versatility here, and he's channeling some kind of early 70s guitar solo vibes on this thing. Short solo, but really worth a listen and adds to the epicness that has already Turned Clouds.
Yeah, definitely. I said so much about that. Maybe Julian Lage sit-ins is the highlight for the whole tour for me as of right now. So Obviously, it means a lot to both of us. We've both spent countless times listening back, so I have no issues with that pick. It's pretty much perfect. So I think we just have one left, Alex. Did you pick out something for Lead the Way here that stood out to you?
I did. This is another song though that doesn't necessarily get as much love on the exploratory jams or improv work sometimes, but I went with a version from Swansea, New Hampshire on June 11th, 2021, where we get a really kind of cool triplet feel that it leans into to start the jam that you'd expect out of something like Atlas Dogs or something like that. And it just kind of evolves into this almost marching sounding one foot in front of the other feel leading into its peak. And then we get really quiet and spacey and atmospheric, and then it leads into that, lead the way outro that you expect with some really great feelings being explored throughout this jam that you don't normally see. Usually it's kind of all uplifting, and this one kind of takes you on a little bit of a ride. So just shout out to this version.
Yeah, it's a great version. I'm actually feeling a little bit weird about some of my picks because typically I'm like a 50-50 split between Dark Goose and Blissy Goose. But this episode, for whatever reason, a lot of my picks have darker sections. And this one's no different. I went with 102921 from Portland, Maine. And it starts off slow and steady with like an atmospheric feel. But then Rick eventually finds some melody that's a bit darker. And Peter kind of picks up on that and runs with it. And then when they start peaking and reaching for tension builds at the end, it's absolutely just psychotic. And I had no other thoughts other than when I was reaching the furious finish of this that these are the jams that you live for. So absolutely awesome Lead the Way. Alex nailed it. It doesn't always take a ton of chances or stray very far from the beaten path, but this one goes out there. So it had to be my pick on this one.
I have not listened to this one in a long time. I got to go check that out. That sounds awesome.
It's the fun of not planning these picks in advance. So we both come out of the episode with a fresh new playlist to listen to, which I always very much look forward to. So part of the fun of doing this podcast.
Yeah, we do like to surprise each other a little bit. So, do you have any final thoughts on Moon Cabin or just kind of comparisons between live and studio or anything else you want to add about Moon Cabin in general?
I mean, just to summarize briefly, I think Moon Cabin is a fantastic first album. I'm every time I come back to it, which I don't spend as much time as I do the live stuff. That takes up the majority of my time. But every time I do come back, it's usually been a little while, and I'm reminded of how great it is. I think that they really do such a great job of capturing their vision of what they wanted it to be. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be a little bit something missing because Goose Live has the most energy of any band that I listen to and the most excitement. So the album is going to be, by its very nature, and like Rick says, trying to accomplish a different goal. It's going to be different. But I really love this album, and the templates for all these great songs that they wrote are there. So it's an amazing first effort.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more there, man. I am definitely a live stan when it comes to Goose, but I do see the value in the studio cuts the more and more I listen to them. I'm obviously not going to listen to them as much, like you mentioned, with us having this podcast and diving into some live tracks and going show by show at times. But you can kind of learn something new about what the band was thinking at the time and different chances they were taking on these studio cuts and how they wanted to separate themselves out away from their live setting to have something that stands alone. And it's just really terrific. The depth that you can get into on these tracks is pretty remarkable, especially for a first effort. So shout out to Moon Cabin. Great album. Some of the best songwriting we've seen from this band that has tons of standouts. So absolutely love it.
Yeah, this was a really fun breakdown to do. I'm glad we did it. I probably should listen to Moon Cabin more often than I do. I should probably come back at least every now and then because it is really impressive, the songwriting at such an early stage in their career. But also looking very much forward to listening to all these live picks that you picked out here as well. So I just want to take this time to thank everyone so much for their support and listening. We cannot wait to see everyone at the benefit shows, and go ahead and follow us on all of the socials at Slow Ready Pod. Wherever you get your podcast, we are there. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.